Hello everyone, my name is Anna and I welcome you all back to another English video where we are going to be continuing with our studies of the Brit Hadasha that have been given here in this YouTube channel of Young Pilgrims. In today's video, we are going to be analyzing chapter 13 and the first 11 verses of chapter 14 of the Good News of Mark. But like always, before we begin analyzing today's chapters, first, we are going to be remembering or we're going to be recapitulating what we saw or what we learned in the previous video, which was based in chapters 11 and 12 of Mark. And the title for that study was Yeshua's Authority Overthrowing Falsehood. In chapter 11, we started off by reading about Yeshua's triumphal entry into Jerusalem. We read how Yeshua sent his two disciples so that they can go get a donkey and he can ride on it and therefore make his entry into Jerusalem like the King of Israel that the people of Israel were waiting for. And all of this he did so that it can be fulfilled what had been mentioned in the prophecy of Zechariah chapter 9 verse 9. In these chapters, we were also seeing and we learned that Yeshua was fulfilling all the necessary requirements that were needed so that he can offer himself as that perfect offering. Because once again, let's remember, and something that we studied in the previous chapters and that we're actually going to continue studying in these two chapters, is that Yeshua's time so that he can give himself as a perfect offering was already approaching. In chapter 11, we also studied about the parable of the barren fig tree, or also known as the parable of the sterile fig tree, where in this parable we learned that Yeshua taught that the religious system of that time represented the fig tree, and that when Yeshua came to this earth to see what were the fruits that this religious system was producing, he found no fruit in them, and for that reason it is why he cursed the religious system so that they would no longer give any fruit. And this was representing what the parable was saying, that when Yeshua found the fig tree and he saw that there was no fruit in it, he cursed the tree. And that's exactly what happened with these religious people. As well, within chapter 11, we were also studying about the purification of the Temple of Jerusalem. And in this event, we were reading that Yeshua goes into the Temple of Jerusalem and he sees that the religious people were taking advantage of the humble people, making them, they took advantage of them by placing difficult burdens that the people had to fulfill, and that the people had to fulfill, and in a certain way they were forced to buy the things that were being sold within this or inside this temple. And Yeshua, we read that Yeshua, seeing all of this injustice and that the religious people were taking advantage of the humble people, not only does he exhort the religious people of all the falsehood and the hypocrisy that they were doing, but he also takes advantage of this time and he purifies or he cleanses this Temple of Jerusalem. Because just as we read in the verses that narrate this event, Yeshua says that the purpose of the temple was so that it can be a holy place where the Spirit of the Eternal would be. But however, the religious people did corrupt it, and therefore it was not a holy place anymore, but rather they made it a place of robbers. So this is what we saw in this event about the purification of the Temple of Jerusalem. In chapter 12, we were also reading, or chapter 11, we were also reading about another parable that Yeshua tells his disciples, and this parable was regarding to the wicked farmers. In this parable, we were reading and Yeshua was teaching us how how he says that he was the son of the owner from this vinery that had been killed by the wicked farmers. So in this parable, we saw that the wicked farmers represented the religious people who, the moment that the owner of this vinery, which the owner represented the Eternal, the moment that in the Eternal sent his prophets and his disciples to teach the message about repentance and going and returning back to the Father, to the people of Israel. The people of Israel, or the religious people of that time, they didn't accept this teaching, but rather they took them to death. And this was exactly what they did to the son of this owner, which the son represented Yeshua. And something that we are going to also be reading and studying about these next these next four last chapters these next four last chapters that we're going to be reading of the good news of Mark, that's exactly what happened with Yeshua. That the religious people, they didn't want anything to do with Yeshua. They didn't want to listen to what Yeshua was teaching, which was good for them and not bad for them, but they saw it as something bad, and therefore they took him, or they gave him death. And this was exactly what Yeshua was teaching within this parable of the wicked farmers. As well, lastly, what we saw in chapter 12 and what we studied was that Yeshua clarifies to his disciples, but as well to the religious people, that he was the messenger of the Almighty. In other words, that he had been sent by the Eternal, that he had been anointed by the Eternal. He was a son of the Eternal. And with that, he also clarified that he was emanated from the heavenly and not from the earthly, or by men. And this was important. This was something important that the Messiah had to clarify, because the people of Israel, thanks to the teachings and thoughts that the religious people put into them, they expected the Messiah to come as a king who was going to establish a physical kingdom, and that was going to liberate them from the oppression that they were going through in that time by the Roman people. But Yeshua, when he said that he was emanated from the heavenly, he was clarifying, and he was clarifying that his kingdom that he was bringing was not a physical one, but rather a spiritual one. And that in that kingdom, it was not going to be necessary for a physical temple to be there, but that it was no longer going to be necessary for a physical temple, because now, and actually something that we're going to be studying in today's chapter, or today's chapter 13, is that Yeshua says that now every soul individually was going to the offerings that they were going to give to the Father, or the way that they were going to serve the Father, was going to be in spirit and in truth. So this was important for Yeshua to say, not only to his disciples, but also to the religious people and the people that were around listening to what Yeshua was saying, so that the falsehood that the religious people were teaching to the rest of the people would break down, or it would break down all of this falsehood that the religious people were teaching to the people of Israel. Lastly, in chapter 12, we were also reading about the poor widowed woman, where she gives us a great lesson of how our offerings should be, which have to be given with sincerity, just as this widow woman who we read that she gave everything she had without doubting, or without trying to seem, or without doing things in falsehood. And it teaches us that our offerings should not be given with hypocrisy, like the religious people did so. We read that Yeshua says that those people, they gave, quote unquote, a lot of offerings just so that they can be seen by the rest of the people as holy people, or as people that did good deeds. Yeshua teaches us the importance of doing things with sincerity and with faith, and not doing things just to be seen, or just to be seen in a good way by the rest of the people. So that is what we read, or what we studied, and what we learned in chapters 11 and 12. In today's video, we are going to be analyzing chapters 13 and the first 11 verses of chapter 14. And the title for today's study is Watching to Save Ourselves from Destruction, Recognizing Yeshua and His Mission. In chapter 13, we are going to be reading that Yeshua he tells his disciples the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem. As well, we're going to be reading that he takes this moment to also teach to his disciples about all the signs that were going to occur and that were going to symbolize the end of the age and the century. As well, we are going to be reading that Yeshua tells them that they were going to have to go through tribulations, that they were going to be suffering physically, and that they were going to be destructions or judgments not only for the people of Israel. This was regarding to the temple of Jerusalem, but also to the people of the nations, which we're going to be reading that Yeshua says, or Yeshua was referring to this when he says that nation would rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, etc. So we're going to be reading about all of this. As well, we're also going to be reading in this whole chapter 13 that Yeshua teaches that there were going to be, that after his death and after he was going to go back to the heavenly oats, there were going to be false prophets and false messiahs who were going to come into the congregation of believers and try to teach them something that the Messiah had not taught, and that it was important for the believers to watch and to pray so that they would not fall into these traps that the false prophets and the false messiahs were going to bring. As well, we are going to be reading in chapter 13, we're going to be reading that Yeshua tells the disciples that his coming is going to be with power and with splendor, and that no one knows, no human being, no one knows, or the day or the hour that his coming is going to occur, except only the Father knows when the day and the hour it's going to occur, the coming of the Messiah. In the first 11 verses of chapter 14, we're going to be reading the first procedures that Yeshua has to go through so that he can offer himself as that perfect korban. Let's remember that the festivity of Pesach and Matzot was approaching, so therefore it meant, or it represented, that Yeshua's time of death was also approaching. In this case, in these verses of chapter 14, we're going to be reading as well about this betrayal that Judah does. Judah, let's remember, he was part of the 12 disciples. He comes into an agreement with the religious people so that they could be able, or that they can have the opportunity to kill the Messiah. And we will be reading that before the sacrifice of the Messiah, he is anointed in Bethany by a woman who was considered as a sinner. However, this woman does this anointing by pouring very expensive perfume over the feet of Yeshua. And in this action that this woman does, we're going to be reading two reactions that his disciples took. One of them being that they were amazed, or they were surprised that Yeshua let himself be touched by a sinner. But the other reaction that we are going to be reading, or that we're going to be reading within these verses, is that there was this disciple. It is believed, or it is said, that it was Judah, who got angry or who got bothered or upset at the fact that this woman used this expensive perfume to pour it over Yeshua's feet. However, we do read that Yeshua ends up telling them that she did a good deed, So that is what we're going to be reading within these two chapters of today's study. And beginning with verses 1 to 13 of chapter 13, we are going to be reading that Yeshua tells his disciples about the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem. As well, we're going to be reading about the signs of the end of the age and the century. The verses of this chapter 13 say, "And as he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, 'Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings.' And Yeshua said to him, 'Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down.' And as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, 'Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the signs when all these things are about to be accomplished?' And Yeshua began saying to them, 'See that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and they will lead many astray. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. These are the beginning of the birth pangs. But be on your guard, for they will deliver you over the councils, and you will be beaten in synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake to bear witness before them." Verse 10, "And the gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations. And when they bring you to trial and deliver you over, do not be anxious beforehand what you are to say, but say whatever is given in you that hour. For it is not you who is speaking, but the Holy Spirit. And brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death." Verse 13, "And you will be hated by all those for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved." In this section of verses that we just finished reading in this chapter 13, we can read two themes that we already have studied in chapter 24 of the Gospel of Matthew. In today's video, or for today's chapter, we are only going to be remembering what we studied in chapter 14, since chapter 14 goes more into detail. The first thing that we can read within these verses is that this disciple, it says that he shows Yeshua the quote-unquote splendor of the temple of Jerusalem that had been rebuilt, and remodeled. The verses don't tell us specifically the reason as to why this disciple had the intention of, I guess we can say, show off the temple of Jerusalem to the Messiah. But whatever the reason was, we can read that the Messiah's response was the opposite, or it was something that the disciple was not expecting. I say this because we can read that Yeshua gives a very profound teaching, and we can even read that he gives a prophecy that was already that had already been fulfilled in the year 70 after the Messiah. And this prophecy that Yeshua gives, it was in reference to the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem. This was something that this was something that the disciple didn't expect, because we can read just by what the disciple tells the Messiah. For the Israelite people, for them, having the temple was like the best thing that they could have had. It was something that they were proud of. And here we can read that Yeshua did not act in the way that this disciple acted. He did not agree with this disciple, but rather told them that all of those buildings that he was admiring, they were going to be destroyed. And later on, we're going to be understanding why Yeshua said this. In addition, in these verses, we can also read that Yeshua teaches that not only the people of Israel were going to receive a judgment, they were not only going to receive a judgment, this was regarding to the destruction of the temple, but also the people of the nations were going to receive a judgment, and this was to the signs of the end of the times, because we can read that Yeshua says that nation would rise around against nation, kingdom against kingdom, brother against brother, children against the father, etc. Returning to what we can read in these verses, the first thing that we can, or the first prophecy that we can read that Yeshua says in these verses is about the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem, which had already been remodeled by the Emperor Herod the Great. And according to what it is written about this reconstruction of the third temple of Jerusalem, it is said that the Emperor Herod, he remodeled the temple according to his understanding and for his own splendor, and not in the way that the Creator had ordered or had commanded in Exodus 20, verses 24 and 25, or what even we can read within the Torah, that the Creator or the purpose of the temple was so that the Creator's presence can be there, and that it was going to be a holy place that was going to be used for sacrifices and offerings. It was going to be a way that the people of Israel were going to use so that they can so that they can have that connection or that communion with the Creator. However, just as I mentioned, the temple of Jerusalem, over the years and over the reconstructions that it had gone through, the temple was only corrupting. It was getting corrupted more and more. And specifically with the temple that was remodeled by this Emperor Herod, the fact that he remodeled it according to his understanding, so that he can receive a recognition by the people, just as we can read, that was precisely what the disciple was doing. He was admiring something that had been remodeled or that had been constructed by a person that didn't do it regarding, or that the person didn't do it fulfilling the commandments that had been given of the purpose of the temple that we can find in Exodus. So because of this reason, it is why the Creator didn't accept the temple anymore. He didn't accept the temple. And this was precisely what Yeshua was also teaching or letting his disciples know. So since the temple was not built in the way that the Creator ordered, but was built according to the understanding of a carnal man, the temple was desecrated. And that is why in these verses, Yeshua makes it very, very clear that the Almighty had rejected this temple, and that he was going to, and that because of that reason, he was going to destroy it. And this, Yeshua, we can even read that he says that not one stone will be left upon another. So by this by this phrase that Yeshua says, we can understand that there was not going to be anything left, not one rock left that would represent the temple of Jerusalem. Everything had to be destroyed. This event, as I mentioned, has already been fulfilled, and we can see it fulfilled historically, that it occurred in the year 70 after the Messiah by the hands of the Emperor Titus the Great, where he destroyed the Temple of Jerusalem. We can even read in the history that this emperor brought many workers to open the foundations of the temple and remove all the stones from that construction. Once again, here we can see this fulfillment of the prophecy that Yeshua said, that no stone will be left upon another. This prophecy that was given by the Messiah caused his disciples to be astonished. It caused the disciples to be surprised by what Yeshua said. Why? Well, because it was something that they did not expect to hear. They didn't want to hear this. Not only because it was something that was admired by the people of Israel, but also because the moment that the temple of Jerusalem was going to be destroyed, it also represented that an exile was going to be occurring, or that an exile was going to come for the people of Israel. And as we can read in the history of the people of Israel, they had already gone through a lot of exile, so obviously they didn't want to go through another one. But we can also read that the Messiah tells them and makes it very, very, very clear to them that all of those people who had ears to listen, who had eyes to see and the mind to understand everything that the Messiah was saying, they were going to have the opportunity to realize and understand that all of this judgment was going to be a consequence to the actions and the bad fruits that not only the religious people were giving, but in general that the people of Israel were giving. And therefore it was necessary for an exile to approach. And it also taught his disciples, Yeshua also taught his disciples with this, that the kingdom that he was bringing was a spiritual one and not a physical one. In addition to the temple, where sacrifices would have to be offered, from that point and onward, the sacrifices were going to be made in the heart and in the life of each soul that lived in a obedient way and in a consecrated way towards the service of the Father. But we can also read that Yeshua says that in order for these people to understand everything that the Messiah was saying, they still needed to receive the promise of the Ruach, or the promise of the Holy Spirit, that was going to allow them to be able to see all the fulfillments of the words of the Messiah that are said within these verses, or within this chapter 13 of Mark. Another thing that we can read in these verses is that the disciples, upon hearing these words of prophecy, were very curious about when all of these signs would happen. The Messiah does not give them a specific date or a specific hour of when all of these things were going to happen, regarding to his coming, regarding to the destructions, to the wars, etc. But Yeshua does tell them that they should learn to see the events and thus recognize the times that were going to approach. In all of this, it teaches us the importance, or in reading all these words of the Messiah, it is important to clarify that Yeshua was not a sorcerer. He was not a fortune teller, as the religious people had already classified him in that time as a fortune teller, but rather in Yeshua was the full acknowledgement of what was going to happen in the future. And this acknowledgement didn't come by him or by himself, but rather it came from the Almighty. So in that way, Yeshua could teach it to his disciples, and thus the disciples would be prepared for these difficult times that were going to approach not only the people of Israel, but in general, all the people in the nations as well. So, as Yeshua said in these verses, they would remain as a testimony for other believers and as well for the nations. Let's remember that the disciples and the apostles were called to give that good testimony. And just as Yeshua said in these verses, that it was important for the gospel to first be given to the people of the nations, and firstly to the people of Israel, which Yeshua did himself, and secondly to the people of the nations, which was going to be the responsibility of the apostles and the disciples. Another thing that we can read within these verses is that Yeshua mentions that many were going to come in his name, saying that they are the Messiah, the king that Israel was waiting for. But in all of that, it would be only a deception. It was going to be something false. This prophecy of the false messiahs that were going to come in the congregation of believers has already been fulfilled in the time of the apostles. And we can even read this fulfillment of the prophecies in 1 John chapter 2 verses 18 to 22, and in 2 Peter 2 verses 1 to 3. Those who want to read it with more detail, they can read it. You guys are free to read it, but as of right now, I'm just going to be mentioning the verses that say that this prophecy was fulfilled. In addition, we can also read that Yeshua mentions about the false prophets that would visit the congregations of believers and would only deceive and lead believers astray. This is also something that has already been fulfilled, and it's even something that continues to be fulfilled in our current days within the religious circles. Why? Well, because we can see that many people claim to be prophets, and even in Judaism, we can read that there are many people who rise saying that they are the Messiah that is going to liberate them from the oppression of the nations. However, all of this, just as Yeshua said, it was all going to be false. It was all going to be used as a form or as a way to make the believers deviate themselves from the faith or from the true path that the Messiah has come to this earth to teach. And it was important for the disciples to understand everything that Yeshua was saying, so that they, just as Yeshua said, they would be that good testimony. They would show a good testimony, not only for the people of Israel, but also for the people of the nations. Another prophecy that we can read in these verses that Yeshua mentions, it is regarding, and that has actually already been fulfilled, is regarding when Yeshua says that there's going to be rumors of wars, and that it would begin with that kingdoms will rise against kingdoms and nations against nations. And this prophecy began to be fulfilled in the 15th century until the 18th century, where we can see historically that it was the times of the darkened era, a time where wars of royalty and nations began. And here, once again, another prophecy being fulfilled. Lastly, another prophecy that we can read within these verses and that has already been fulfilled was regarding to the plagues, famines, earthquakes, natural phenomena, and the signs that were going to occur or that were going to be seen in the heaven regarding to the signs of the end of the age, or of the end of the century, or of the end of the century. Yeshua mentions in these verses about these signs and how it was going to happen, what the signs were going to be, etc. And all of this prophecy regarding to all of these signs is something that has already happened. It has happened from the 20th century onwards, or till our days. And these words of the Messiah, reading all of these words of the Messiah and seeing them being fulfilled in human history, it gives us a teaching that all this judgment comes as a consequence of the hardness of the heart of men, making a representation that the wickedness of humanity is increasing day by day. It's not decreasing, but rather increasing. So it is important when reading these words of the Messiah and historically seeing that they have already been fulfilled, it is important that we know how, just as Yeshua said to his disciples, to distinguish these times and always be preparing ourselves for the coming of the Messiah. And although, yes, just as Yeshua said in these verses, that no one knows the day or the hour exact of his coming, but that it is important for us to prepare and occupy ourselves continually, or occupy ourselves in the service of the Father, continuously sanctifying ourselves through the obedience to the instruction and the communion with our Father. Because if we are not sanctifying ourselves, if we are not having that communion with our Father, if we are not occupying and preparing ourselves in the service that we must give to the Father, then when we are going to be found as a religious people at that time. That Yeshua came, he found no fruit, therefore they were cursed. So this gives us a great teaching and as well a great exhortation, especially if we call ourselves true disciples of the Messiah and true sons and daughters of the Creator. Also, just as Yeshua teaches us throughout his good news that we can read in Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, that Yeshua always teaches the importance of always watching and praying for one another. So all of this really does give us a valuable lesson, a valuable exhortation of how we must make sure that we are always watching, that we are always sanctifying ourselves in obedience in the instruction, and occupying ourselves to the service of the Father, so that in that way we can see all of these signs that are occurring, and therefore we can be in alert of our surroundings. From verses 14 to 31, we can continue reading about the signs that will occur in the last times, and even we can read how the coming of the Messiah would be. We can read about the coming of the Messiah in verses 24 to 27, where Yeshua says, "But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. And the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken." Verse 26. "And then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and splendor. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heavens." So here we can see how the coming of the Messiah is going to be something very, very big, because we can read that it says that it is going to be dark, that the moon will not give its light. And once again, this teaches us and it reminds us the importance of watching the times, of watching our surroundings, preparing ourselves for the coming of the Messiah. Throughout our studies that we have been having regarding these two Gospels, Matthew and Mark, we can see that in several occasions, Yeshua repeats to his disciples the instruction to keep watching. Even later on in our studies that we're going to be having about the letters to the nations, we're going to be reading that the emissaries also transmitted the same instruction that the Messiah had given to them regarding to the importance of the importance to keep watching. So actually in this we can see that the emissaries fulfilled what the Messiah told them, that it was important for the gospel, for the instruction to be given to the nations as well. Something that the emissaries had to fulfill, and that we can read that it was fulfilled. The apostles reminded the believers of this instruction because they themselves knew that it required a great effort for believers to remain firm. In the letters to the nations, we can read that in the lives of the apostles and of the disciples, they would go through all the difficult circumstances, or through all the difficult situations that the Messiah told them that they had to go through. And these circumstances or these situations were regarding to the tribulations, persecutions, and even the death that they would have to go through because of Yeshua's teachings. But on the other hand, in the letters to the nations, we can read that the apostles and the disciples knew that they would receive a great and valuable reward for persevering until the end. So with this, we can see that the apostles and that the disciples, they didn't really care what physically they could go through in regarding to the sentences of death that they would have to go through, the tribulations, the persecutions, the injustice, etc. For them, that didn't really matter. What mattered for them and what helped them was that they would have their gaze in the heavenly things. And it teaches us the importance of living the same way as the emissaries. For us to not really give importance, or to not give importance to what physically we can suffer, but rather always having our gaze in the heavenly things, which just as the disciples or the apostles, they believed that it was a valuable award that they can receive. And this should also be the same way that we should see, or that we should live this life that the Eternal allows us to have. And for this reason, it is why Paul said that the afflictions that the apostles and that disciples went through were nothing compared to the splendor that would be manifested in them. Now, as believers, these words that we can read not only in the teachings of the Messiah, but also in the letters that the emissaries wrote to the nations, it exhorts us. Because although we do not have to go through literally everything that the disciples went through regarding to the persecutions, through the death that they would be sentenced to, through the injustice, etc., because the times are not the same. We are not living the same times or the same events that they lived. But it does give us an exhortation, and it does help us to prepare ourselves that we have to prepare ourselves mentally and spiritually to understand that we are, or if not, that we have to go through, or that we are actually starting to go through many challenges that we have to face, and not only face, but also overcome. And this we can overcome with the help of the Eternal's Spirit, and with the Eternal's instruction, and also what the Messiah teaches us. The Messiah himself, we can see that his life was not simple. His life was not easy. He also went through tribulations. He also went through injustice. He also went through situations that he had to overcome as a human being. And as well, our life is not, especially as believers, our life is not going to be easy. Our life is not going to be all roses and love. Rather, our life is going to be difficult. We are going to be facing a lot of challenges, but just because of that, it does not mean that we're going to play victims. It does not mean that we're going to be whining about the things that happen in our life. Rather, we are going to learn from them, and the lesson that we learn, we are going to apply in our lives. So in that way, we can continue growing, not only spiritually, but also we can continue maturing as people. So this is a great lesson, and a very valuable lesson that we can see, or that we can be given, or that we can receive from the words of the Messiah and the letters that the emissaries wrote to the nations. As well, we can see that it is important to always keep in mind that we are called to continue towards the goal, and towards the goal that we have, which is the celestial promises, and that the trials that we are going to go through do not or should not make us go backwards, living in sin, but rather it should. Every situation that we go through, it needs to help us grow and strengthen our faith. For as we read in the words of the Messiah, in verse 13 of this chapter 13, that the Messiah says that only he who remains faithful will, or until the coming of Yeshua, will be able to receive the promise of the eternal life. In Romans 13 verses 11 and 12, we can read that Paul says, "The hour has already come for you to wake up from your slumber, because our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed." And in 1 Peter chapter 5 verses 8 to 9, it says, "Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy the devil prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. Resist him, standing firm in the faith, because you know that the family of believers throughout the world is undergoing the same kind of sufferings." From verses 35 to 37, we can read another great exhortation from the Messiah to his disciples, and this was regarding to the importance of remaining vigilant in faithfulness until his coming. In these verses, Yeshua teaches us that it is important that the Messiah, upon his coming, finds us working in his kingdom. In other words, busy in the service of the eternal, and remaining in obedience, and not focusing on the things of the world or in the things of our carnality, which only bring us destruction, and that would only separate us from the Creator. To finalize today's study, verses 3 to 11 of chapter 14, it says, "And while he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of anointment of pure nard very closely, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, 'Why was the anointment wasted like that? For this anointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor.' And they scolded her. Verse 6, but Yeshua said, 'Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you could do good for them. But you will not always have me with you.' Verse 8, she has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand, my burial. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the world, what she has done will be told in memory of her." Verse 10, Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 disciples, went to the chief priests to betray Yeshua to them. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money. So he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. In these verses, we can read about the anointment that this woman did to the Messiah in Bethany. In verses 1 and 2 of this chapter 14, we can read that the religious leadership of that time did not give up on the idea of killing Yeshua. Their hatred and indignation towards him grew more and more. So much so that we can read that they only looked for opportunities to kill Yeshua. In this case, we can read that these people got this opportunity through Judas, who made a deal with the religious people so that he can betray Yeshua, giving Yeshua to the religious people. And although, as we studied in the Gospel of Matthew, and that we're going to be studying in the next chapters of this good news of Mark, we can see and we have to understand that all of this that was going to be occurring with Yeshua and his death or his offering was something that the Father was allowing. In this case, this betrayal from Judas. It was something that the Father allowed. Why? Well, because the delivery of the Messiah was already approaching, and this delivery had to happen at a specific time. It was not whenever, but at a specific time, which this time was already approaching. Once again, we can see it being, or the reason why we say that it was approaching was because in the beginning of chapter 14, we can read that it says that the festivity of Pesach was approaching, so therefore it meant that the death of the Messiah was also approaching. In these verses, we can read that the religious people offered Judas money in exchange for handing over Yeshua. In this attitude that Judas showed, this attitude that Judas took, it shows us what really was inside of him and who he really served. Because we can read that he let himself be carried away by his desires, which were based in money, or they were influenced in the money, without considering what he was about to do, which was going to be considered as a great betrayal, because he did say, or he was considered as part of the 12 disciples of the Messiah. So this betrayal that Judas was going to do, it was a really big deal. This teaches us, in this whole betrayal of Judas, it teaches us that it is very, very important that every time that we are going to be making a decision in our life, to stop and analyze if that decision is according to the will of the eternal, or if it is a decision that is guided only by our human emotions. And also, it teaches us the importance of acting with self-control, because an incorrect decision that we take in our life can bring us a terrible consequence that causes affliction and loss in our lives, just as we're going to be reading in the rest of this chapter 14 that occurred with Judas, that after his betrayal and after all of this, after he felt the guilt of the wrong decision that he took, which was imposed by his human emotions, the only thing that he found was death, not only physically but also spiritually. So this really does teach us a valuable lesson. In Proverbs 14, verses 12 to 16, we can read the following. It says, "There is a way that appears to be right, but in the end it leads to death. Even in laughter the heart may ache, and rejoicing may end in grief. The faithless will be fully repaid for their ways, and the good rewarded for theirs." 15. "The simple believe anything, but the prudent give thought to their steps. The wise fear the eternal and shun evil, but a fool is hot-headed and yet feels secure." We can read in these verses another important thing that we must mention, which is that it says that 2 days, or these verses say that 2 days before the celebration of Pesach, Yeshua was anointed in Bethany while he was in Simon's house. And although in our versions we do read that it says that this man, Simon, was a leper man, however, we do with the scriptures, we can come to the conclusion that this was not correct. Why? Well, because it was not possible, because being in a state or having this illness of leprosy, in the Torah we can read that it was not allowed for a person that had leper to be in a house, especially with people. And this is something that we have already studied, that it was prohibited to have leprosy and to be in a house with people. So with this, we can understand that specifically that Simon didn't have leprosy the moment that Yeshua was there. In itself, the specific reason why the verses say that this man was a leper or had leprosy, it is not well known. It is not something sure of what it was referring to, but it is said, or it is believed, that possibly the verses were referring that Simon in the past had leprosy, and that later on he had been healed by Yeshua, which allowed him to be in this house accompanied by Yeshua and his disciples. Another important factor that we can read in these verses is that the woman who poured this expensive oil or this expensive perfume on Yeshua did so as a sign of reverence and gratitude towards him. But we can read that when the disciples, and it is also believed that it was specifically Judas who gave this reaction of complaining, or of complaining, and therefore exhorting this woman, it was not something that was expected. And we can even read that the Messiah told them that she did a good deed, because although helping the poor, the reason why she did a good deed was because Yeshua said that they had the poor and that they could do good deeds to the poor anytime, but that the Messiah was not going to be with them all the time. So that's why this action this anointment that this woman did was very important, and it was something very valuable for the Messiah. However, on that occasion, we can read in these verses that it was essential for this anointment to be done to the Messiah, because it was the preparation for his death. He was about to be handed over to the religious people, which meant that he was going to be given into death. And he was going to be offering himself as that perfect offering that had to be given in the festivities of Pesach. That's why Yeshua had to die in the days of the festivity of Pesach. This is all for today's video. Thank you very much for your time, and we will see each other in the next one. Bye.